Hi, my name is Nidhi Rao. I'm a senior at Tufts and I'm majoring in international relations and Spanish. And today my lightning talk is going to cover my IR senior honors thesis. My title is Assimilation Beyond Earnings, and my thesis is about measuring intergenerational changes for career aspirations and job satisfaction levels for two cohorts of Mexican immigrants living in specifically San Antonio and Los Angeles. So, my thesis comes from a desire to extend the conventional economic definition of assimilation, which is generally comparing foreign born individuals to their native born counterparts and seeing if they earn the same wages over time. And if they do, they're quote unquote assimilated. So, I took issue with this rather sterile sort of way of measuring assimilation. And I wanted my senior thesis to sort of challenge that definition, extend it a bit to include how migrants define and perceive their own success as a metric for assimilation. So in my analysis, I use variables of occupational satisfaction levels and career aspirations as a way of understanding intergenerational changes for Mexican migrants in the US. It's important to note that I am a migrant myself. I grew up moving around a lot. And so growing up, I often thought about what it meant to assimilate. And this thesis is really derived from a personal history as well. And I chose to focus on Mexican migrants because this is a very special group in the US right now that has faced a lot of contentious public scrutiny. And so that was one reason. And the second reason is that this group has been in the US or US territories for a very, very long time. And so they've got generations past the third living in US territories at this point. And at one point, they were part of their own territories. So Mexico and the US share a very complicated history of conquest, colonial baggage, and immigration policy. So my research questions kind of fell into three different buckets. I wanted to look at intergenerational change in these two dependent variables, and then also unpack what are the determinants for occupational satisfaction levels and what are the determinants for career priority choices for Mexican migrants. And to do so, I take a variety of statistical methods from chi-square tests to an ordinary least squares regression to a multinomial logit model to assess each category. Um, my data comes from the Mexican American Study Project. It was taken in 1965 and 1998, so mid to late 1900s. And it was taken specifically in San Antonio and Los Angeles, conducted by two sociologists, so a very holistic survey. And what's unique about this data set is that it's actually intergenerational. So the respondents from the 1965 set were actually the parents of those who were in 1998. So I get to see this true familial nature to the data set, which you don't get in like using the census. Um, Also, San Antonio and Los Angeles are very important cities for Mexican immigrants. And however, this data set had its own limitations. It was legacy data, so I had to make a lot of assumptions about what questions were related to what questions in the code books and the data sets. So a lot of it had to be assumed, as well as some outdated gender norms. And the data was self-reported, so there's always problems with that. And one key thing to note is that I didn't have any case identifiers, which meant that I wasn't able to actually identify that this person is the child of this person. So, but nevertheless, I knew that this data set was intergenerational, so it was very valuable for my research. So my two dependent variables were career goals and priorities and occupational satisfaction levels. Respondents were asked to choose one out of the 9 options and say which one they prioritize the most. Obviously, the nature of this question imposes a mutual exclusivity that you have to choose one, when in reality, like you could be prioritizing a lot of these things. So that's a limitation to the way this was coded. But as for occupational satisfaction level, it's pretty much a 4-tier response, 4 being very satisfied, 1 being not at all satisfied. The literature on this is fairly scarce. I started by looking at dimensions and disciplines of assimilation, looking at how scholars of sociology to economists kind of look at this topic using the variables listed here. And then I took a subject-centered approach. So I looked at people who placed migrants at the center of their studies, asked them about their aspirations, their lives, and a lot of the research in this domain is largely qualitative. And then research in occupational aspirations and satisfaction levels is quite limited, but I saw a lot of stream of literature on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, looking at how children of immigrants are more likely to prioritize things like higher self-actualized needs over basic financial security. So my results. So for my first bucket, looking at intergenerational change, I found that the children of immigrants were more likely to prioritize things like interest in work more than their parents, and parents were more likely to prioritize financial aspects more than their kids. But as for the other categories, they were largely similar between the parents and children. And the differences between the two generations wasn't significant, statistically significant for occupational satisfaction levels. So children and parents had relatively the same satisfaction levels over time. In terms of what were the determinants of occupational satisfaction levels, I found that human capital, age, and location mattered in a statistically significant way. Those with higher human capital, which is language capacity and education, were more satisfied with their jobs. Older respondents were more satisfied with their jobs, and those from San Antonio were more satisfied with their jobs. So clearly there's a relationship between having a human capital and happiness and with age, and those from San Antonio as well. And then I did a multinomial logit model to assess career priorities. And I found that this trend in two buckets started to appear again. So those who prioritize job security versus those who had more like self-actualized needs like interest in work. And I found that those with more human capital were prioritizing an interest in work. So those with more education were more likely to prioritize interest in work over security and stability or job training, etc. Location also mattered. Actually, people from San Antonio were prioritizing things like security and stability more so than their Los Angeles counterparts, probably because in the late 1900s, they didn't have as dynamic of an economy. There was very little unionization, the poverty rates were higher. They were making about half, the average income was about half of that of Los Angeles, so perhaps those played an impact. And lastly, gender had an influence. So females were actually more likely to prioritize interest in work over a lot of the other categories, which showcased that females were actually taking on more self-actualized priorities, female migrants. And so I ran the model twice, and this time I did it relative to financial aspects. And here I found that San Antonio residents really valued job training, even more so than their financial aspects. And this is maybe due to industry change over time. And in terms of human capital, those with more human capital were prioritizing things like other, which were social prestige. And one thing I came away from doing this analysis was that there are subjective understandings to all of the career priorities, like what good future means to me might be different to you. And this is something the data did not capture and the survey questionnaire simply did not capture. So that's something important to keep in mind. So why does this matter? Well, my key conclusions are, well, my data does have its limitations, the models had its limitations, but I noticed a sort of hierarchy of needs when we look at intergenerational change for career priorities for Mexican migrants. So people in the second gen were really prioritizing things like interest in work over their parents, which is a very interesting change that isn't seen in the literature as much. As for satisfaction levels, surprisingly, they haven't changed drastically. But I think future research can work to include a more holistic analysis of variables such as citizenship, social networks, and culture, seeing that the issue of legal residency is becoming increasingly important in today's world. And then in terms of migrants, just understanding that mixed migration is a thing. Not everyone comes to the US as an economic migrant. And then lastly, I would push for more intergenerational research. There's so many surveys that have happened in the past, and we really need to follow up on those to really track intergenerational mobility and change. So ultimately, why does this matter and so what? I just think that Measuring occupational satisfaction levels and career priorities is one key way to humanize our conversation about migrant assimilation. And simply asking people, are you happy with your job? And what do you want to do with your life is one key way to understand how migrants are assimilating and how to make the American dream a little bit more inclusive. Yep, that concludes my lightning thought talk. Please email me or let me know if you have any questions. And thank you so much for listening.